As part of the lesson we're covering today, we're going to discuss a little bit of protest forms, not only during the colonial period leading up to the revolution, but since then throughout history. And a lot of this links around human rights. Human rights are generally considered to be rights that belong to every person. It's a common agreement among people within a community, a nation, or even worldwide today. But during the colonial period, there were certain rights that we've talked about. No taxation without representation was a common cry. And so we oftentimes will show our displeasure over a government policy or a group policy through something called a protest. Protest is simply expressing an opposition to a decision or policy. Now, governments constantly have to balance out a person's right to protest versus national security concerns. After the revolutionary period and the creation of the Constitution, the First Amendment protects our rights, but that did not exist during and before the Revolutionary War. So when colonists had issues, they weren't protected by any law to protest. And there's a whole wide range of protests. There are the direct action protests. This is where people will disrupt a business, disrupt a community. They will hold strikes, boycotts, demonstrations. Or there are passive actions. This is petitions, writing letters, trying to do things that aren't necessarily disruptive. And of course, in all of these, they can be both violent and nonviolent. So protests are arrayed in a wide area, but there are generally three forms that we're going to talk about, not only in this unit, but throughout the next 2 years. The first one are political protests. This is where we use voting and government systems such as our courts to stop an injustice. A petition, for example, is a signed request from people in a community that's demanding change in a government policy. Gathering, called an assembly. This is where a group of people gather to pressure a change. We saw that at the beginning of the Reno Black Lives Matter protest. And again, this idea of a march, people who walk to a rally as a way of demanding change. The most common American system is voting. That's using a ballot to vote for new candidates and new laws. During the constitutional and revolutionary time, the Olive Branch Petition. This is when the king is being asked by the colonists in order to step in. It's a letter that was sent out, and you can see one of the quotes is, "The apprehensions which now oppress our hearts with unspeakable grief, being once removed, your majesty will find your faithful subjects on this continent ready and willing at all times to assert and maintain the rights and interests of your majesty and our mother country." In other words, if you help us, we will continue to love and support you. Other times in American history, Dr. King, during his protest over civil rights, letters from a Birmingham jail, where he went to jail willingly as a protest. In 1989, following speeches by President Reagan and other world leaders, people in Berlin began to demand the removing of the Berlin Wall. There's also economic protests. Economic protests focus on the finances that's going to force change, oftentimes using a boycott where you refuse to buy a product. This is to protest or to punish a business or government. Sometimes it's a work stoppage called a strike. You can also use a lawsuit. That's trying to use court action to force a change. So back to the colonial period, the Stamp Act in 1765. Remember, that's a direct British tax on all documents and papers in the colonies. The colonists, as their demands were not being met, they refused to buy products. It hurt English business, and England eventually ended the law. So that's an example of an economic protest that worked. Today, we tend to see people boycotting the NFL because they disagree with kneeling during the national anthem. Others are boycotting Amazon because of their business practices and how they hire and fire employees. Anything that has to do with money is usually called an economic protest. The third kind is extra-legal protests. Extra-legal protests break the law or reject the entire social system. So back to the Reno protests, when it became a riot, as you can see in the picture here, they started smashing windows, destroying property. That's when it became outside the law, extra legal. This refusing the orders of a government, eventually turning into a riot. This is where violence occurs by a crowd because they're showing anger or demanding some sort of change. Worst case scenario, the revolution. Not only the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution in 1917, but the American Revolution, which is what we in our unit are building up to. Up at the top left, you can see the French Revolution. On the bottom right, the Boston Massacre. Both cases where violence and civil unrest has broken out. Now, for today's lesson, we have already on a previous lesson read Chapter 3, Section 5. Today, you're going to read a short article on colonial protests, and we've already completed class notes. So between all of this and this video, you have the information to complete a comparison contrast on the Boston Tea Party with the Boston Massacre on a Venn diagram. That's going to be on your Teams page, and some things to consider to write about when you're looking at the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre. Violent versus peaceful. Were any of them violent? Were any of them peaceful? In each case, what were they mad about? What was the reaction of the British for the Tea Party and then for the massacre? Who started it? Why did they start it? What type of protest was each? So go back to this video and think about what was the target, what was the goal? Was it a political protest? Was it an economic protest? Was it an extra-legal protest? Where did each take place? Was their property destroyed? And you will fill in on your Word document the things that they both have in common. So if the Tea Party and the massacre have something in common, you'll put them there. You'll have two things you'll put into the shared experience that they both have in common. Then you'll find two things that only were unique to the Boston Massacre. And finally, two things that were unique to the Boston Tea Party. Sometimes people have a hard time with Venn diagrams, so I want to take a minute and I want to compare, as we say, apples to oranges. Now, both apples and oranges grow on trees. They're both used to make juice. Apples, however, originally come from Turkey. Both are fruit. Apples have a very thin skin. Oranges originally come from India, and oranges have a thick skin. So we want to look for the things that they both have in common. Well, they both grow on trees. They're both used to make juice, and they both are fruit. So if we were doing a Venn diagram, they both in the middle are fruit. They grow on trees, and they both provide juice. Now let's look at what's unique to just the apples. The apple originally comes from Turkey. Apples have a very thick skin, or thin skin, pardon me. So when we go over to apples, there is a thin skin, and they come from Turkey. Same thing with oranges. So what is the only thing that oranges have apart from the others? They originally come from India, and they have a very thick skin. And as you can see over here, oranges, a thick peel, and they come from India. So the Venn diagram is showing what do they have in common, what is unique to apples, what is unique to oranges. If you have any questions, please come to me in between classes. You can also email me. We can do a video chat if you need to. I'll start holding large video chats after school, give you guys about an hour or so to get home, and then I'll announce where you can go online in order to join with that if you do need help. Again, any questions, please contact me, and thank you so much for working hard online during this entire COVID-19 period.